If you really listen to this talk, you'll be able to call BS on 90% of Agile coaches. We're going to give 4 definitions, and then we're going to cover 4 misconceptions about multi-team Scrum and Agile, software development in particular. Those 4 misconceptions, one of them has 5 variations, so you might call that 9 misconceptions. We have a bonus topic we'll get into, alternatives to Scrum of Scrums. At the end, we'll reveal the main misconception that 90% of Agile coaches and even quite a few Scrum trainers and other people still have about multiple team software development, and how those misconceptions are counterproductive towards our intended aims. They're actually harmful. But it's useful to understand the definitions and the prior assumptions before we get to that. This went viral on LinkedIn faster than anything else I've written, including the Scrum Master checklist and the videos and everything else. For some reason, this really hit a nerve. Apparently, the way that people are doing Scrum right now is causing pain and harm, and everyone's sensing that. And unfortunately, that way of doing it is still being sold. The first definition I'll give you is system optimization goal. When I used to do Agile consulting, we would start by asking about pain points, which is close to the right question. It's on the boundaries of the right question. System optimization, something which is emphasized in less, as far as I can tell, more than the other methods that are there. We might consider some goals consistent with agility, or let's say adaptability. And we might consider other goals inconsistent with that, or even with each other. I'm not seeing this emphasized enough in the people's work. And so we get arbitrary results. I observed an overall retrospective. Overall retrospective is, by the way, a great practice that's in large-scale Scrum and probably intuitively obvious to people who have multiple teams doing Scrum. And that's where not only do teams do their retrospective at the end of a sprint, but teams of teams get together and they collaborate with each other and with the management of the organization and the product owner and the Scrum Masters about what are the systemic issues preventing the best delivery of value or best learning about what customer needs are. An overall retrospective is a great practice, but if you take the practice without the understanding of why, you will wind up with arbitrary optimizations. And the place I was working with, their problems were caused by excess organizational complexity. And without the deep understanding of that, and without clarity about the optimization goal of the overall retrospective, management didn't agree about why they were doing this. Just send everyone to training is a typical pattern that we've seen a lot. But we don't actually know what problem we're going to solve. And so we wind up trying to solve contradictory problems, and we wind up with unimpressive results way too often. Ken Schwaber observed this very early when he wrote that in most organizations, I think he said 70%, most organizations trying to do Scrum won't get the benefit. 70% might have been optimistic that won't succeed at this or won't get the benefits that are intended in Scrum. Another related term that we'll use, local optimization bias. So the first term again was system optimization goal. Now I'll talk about local optimization bias. I will suggest that as human beings, we have a tendency to try to improve things. That's a natural thing to do. And of course, Scrum tries to do that. And typically the sprint retrospective is one of the places where we make adjustments. We try to optimize things. Now, the problem is that we tend to optimize around what's right in front of us, or what short term. We're sort of wired for short-term thinking, or what's immediately in front of us. And if we get into a large organization, we have 5 teams or 500 teams all trying to build a product together. Actions that you might take that might appear to be improving things in the local perspective actually will cause harm to the larger system. Example of this would be, we have got to improve our velocity. Our team has got to crank out more crap code that doesn't integrate with the other products, other teams, and ultimately the product goes out with more bugs and less understanding. Local optimization bias, very powerful thing. We're all subject to it. It permeates your organization. It's everywhere. I have it, you have it, and it takes conscious effort, takes thinking slow and careful observation of our own actions to be aware of this local optimization bias. Otherwise, it'll be very hard to actually make an effective change to the larger system. I'll give a third definition, my twist on a term, knowledge creation work. Now, there was a term knowledge work that I think Peter Drucker popularized, which was, creating value based on knowledge that we've acquired in the past. I will suggest, for software development in particular, new product development in general, I will suggest knowledge creation work. Let's say you'd spend Monday through Thursday trying to get a software product to work. And it wouldn't have to be software product if you're not a programmer. Think about a report you've written or some other product of your mind. And so you spent Monday working on it. You were totally stuck. You slept on it. Tuesday, you woke up and you wound up throwing away everything you did on Monday because it was off track. You did some research and you learned some things. You came up with some better ideas, showed them to your colleague or maybe your spouse. By Wednesday, you thought you've got a good idea. You show it to more people, get feedback. You learn some more things. You discover something someone else has tried that didn't work. So you keep some of what you did. Thursday, you've got something you think it's in good shape now. And then Thursday night, you lose your files and all the work you've done since Monday is lost. But is it really lost? It's not lost. On Friday morning, by 10 o'clock, or whenever you wake up, maybe an hour after you woke up, you'll be ahead of where you were Thursday night. And it's because the work you did wasn't typing. That was not the constraint. The limitation on knowledge creation work is learning, your ability to create knowledge, learn things, and synthesize that and learn and make something new. So we'll call this knowledge creation work, which is in some fundamental ways different than traditional management assumptions about what work is and what effective work is. Yeah, leading back to all kinds of optimizations, which are probably harmful towards agility. Now, we didn't define agility, did we? Adapting, learning and adapting to reality as we discover it. This is what I thought the focus of Scrum was supposed to be also. We'll start from the assumption that we don't know everything about what the customer needs. We don't know everything about our own skills. We don't know exactly how or what we're going to do. And we would like to optimize our organization around the ability to have that because we believe the company that can outlearn its competition is the one that will be more successful, is the one that will survive the rate of change, which is accelerating. And then another fourth definition I'll give is private code ownership. Now, this doesn't exist as a distinction for many people because it's like fish not knowing about water. It's the habit in so many organizations now that only Bob can work on this, or maybe only Bob's team can work on this piece of software. Only another team can work on this piece of software. If we're not using effective practices like test-driven development, like constant merciless refactoring, like continuous integration, if we don't have an internal open source policy, then perhaps private code ownership is a necessary reality. But we need to be able to recognize it and distinguish it when it's there, because it can be quite poisonous to the optimization goal if we're looking at the big picture, optimizing for a whole product view rather than just a micro view. I hope those definitions made some sense. By the way, I wrote this in response to comments mostly from Agile coaches. Okay, now we'll get into the misconceptions. Misconception 1 is around dependencies. In traditional work, dependencies are caused by real hard constraints that are somewhat bound to the laws of physics. If I'm going to build a skyscraper, there's not a whole lot of point in putting the carpeting in if I don't even have the hole in the ground yet. I can't do a lot of things because of the laws of gravity, because we can't really start digging the hole till we have whatever the machine is that digs the holes, etc. It doesn't matter if we have all the cement in the world if we can't do this. So it makes a lot of sense in traditional work to think about dependencies and to make a chart that maps them and to make kind of a project plan, especially if it's something we've done millions of times before. Then it makes perfect sense to focus on how things are dependent on each other and make a project plan based on that. Dependencies in knowledge work ultimately caused by knowledge gaps. If the constraint in knowledge work is the ability to create knowledge and to understand the customer's needs and the technology we're using and other things, how to work with each other, other things, the internal constraints in our organization. Dependencies are softer than we thought they were if you've spent more time with your eyes open, watching what teams are doing, getting into the code, seeing what the real constraints are, realize that the dependencies are being caused by the belief that they're real. They're being caused also by our organizational structure and policies. For instance, only this team does that, only this team does that. This team is driven by what I'll call team output owner, which means they have local optimization. They're focusing just on doing this. And what happens is we dig the rut deeper and deeper. This leads us to misconception 2, which is very easy to believe this. I fall into this also. The idea that all teams are probably working on roughly equal value work. That is probably not true in your organization. It certainly isn't true from the places I've been working with. I think it's not hard for you to imagine a situation, let's say you have 12 teams doing something. Not hard to imagine a situation where the work of one team is 1,000 times more important than the work of another team. I don't think you have too much trouble imagining that happening in a real organization, in a big company, after it's built up the silos. Unfortunately, there are Scrum implementations or ways of introducing Scrum which have made that worse, made this problem worse. And the illusion that we're doing the most important thing can be caused by local optimization bias and some other stuff, focusing just on our team's backlog, for instance, rather than being able to look at the whole picture. And that leads to misconception number 3 in my list, which is, should the team have a narrow view or a whole product view? What happens, unfortunately, is a tendency to optimize for velocity, our team velocity. And that leads to things like Scrum Masters preventing teams from talking to each other because we want our team to just focus on their work. When we have a narrow view on the problem instead of a whole product view, we wind up with results that are suboptimal for the whole product. We are not applying the power of team self-management to the whole product when we're doing this. This is an assumption in the Agile Manifesto. I believe it because I've seen it. The best design requirements, code, come from self-organizing teams. And so we believe in self-organization that works. We extend that to even self-management and less. Seeing it work, firsthand experience with that work. And without that firsthand experience, I'm not sure how persuasive I can be. I don't know if I can convince you. Misconception 4. Now this actually breaks into a whole bunch of pieces. Will components from different teams integrate into a feature without those teams working together? And remember, we're talking about, the topic is less. The topic is large scale Scrum. If we have a single team organization, our company has just 12 people in it, which is my experience when I first started doing Scrum. And so I had a lot of ideas about how to make it work in a 12-person company. And some of those ideas not as helpful when we get into larger organizations. Will components from different teams integrate? If we think that the work product is just the result of all the apples that 1,000 people have picked, and we can just put them in boxes and ship them out, then we'll fall into this trap. But a software product is not that. A software product has lots of pieces that have to work together. Some people will call these dependencies. I'll call them shared work that has to happen. Will they just integrate into a feature without teams collaborating? And let's go into some of the subcases of this. Doesn't XYZ technical approach eliminate the need for teams to work together? Because we're having so much trouble, I guess, getting teams to work together. And I suggest these problems are actually caused by the policies and the structure of the organization, the organizational design. A lot of companies haven't solved that problem. We keep rolling out technical silver bullets that are supposed to solve this. I remember when there's something called remote procedure call was supposed to solve this. Remember when XML was supposed to solve this. Remember when SOAP was supposed to solve this? And now it's, what is it, 2020 already? Now microservices is supposed to solve this. I won't comment on whether microservices is a sound architecture in any given situation. It might be a sound technical approach, but it's sometimes being sold as a way to have teams that don't have to work together. And I don't expect it to be any more successful than the previous 20 years of silver bullets were for that problem. The XYZ technical approach does not eliminate the need for teams to work together. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use those approaches. They're great approaches. Just don't pretend it's going to solve the need for collaboration across multiple teams. This is something that we're very explicit about in large-scale Scrum. How do we create the environment where teams will naturally work together? That was 4.1.1. Doesn't XYZ technical approach eliminate the need for teams to work together? I don't think so. Okay, let's take 4.1.2, very related topic. Don't well-defined interfaces, open standards, etc., eliminate the needs for teams to work together? Let's be really clear. I'm a big fan of well-defined interfaces, open standards. I'm a huge fan of open source software, all those things. No opposition to any of that. That's great stuff. Let's not pretend it eliminates the need for teams to work together. So a well-defined API works when one side isn't changing. Situation with my client, and I think most real companies, is that both sides are changing. So we have a well-established API for some things, like HTTP. It's a great standard. And once we have that, then that means our team developing the browser doesn't have to work very closely with the team, or at all, perhaps, with the team developing the server. So in that situation where neither side are changing, at least the fundamental low-level interface like that, then there isn't a need for collaboration. But take a real product where we're doing something novel, and the thing that's being provided by this part of the software, the requirements for that will continue to evolve, just like as they'll change on this side. So both sides are changing, and just making a book. Now, back when I started, it was aerospace. We had these things called interface requirements documents, and we would lock them down, get them signed off by everyone, because we know if we screw that up, it's going to be a huge pain in the future. This is all based on the idea that requirements won't change. Pretty sure in your life, the software you're developing, requirements are changing. And so trying to do it with a document isn't going to work. This doesn't mean that we eliminate documentation. By the way, my favorite kind of specification is specification by example. Executable specification, an enabling specification. These are specs that don't lie. Specification by example, these are great techniques for getting business people and technical people to work together. Let's go to misconception 4.2. Will features from different teams integrate into one product without the teams working together? So we have team A and team B. Will their stuff just work together? So now we've gone to feature teams. So in the previous example, we're talking about, we have component teams where we have a back-end team and a front-end team. And obviously there's a need for those. If we're organized that way, and probably mostly we shouldn't be organized that way, with some exceptions, we're going to have all kinds of problems. And especially if each team is focusing on their velocity of their output rather than the whole picture. Let's say, okay, now we've learned about feature teams. Now we have teams that can do front end and back end work and the middle tiers and all that stuff. That does not solve the problem completely. Now you should do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You absolutely should consider doing that at least. But that doesn't solve the problems. Those teams will still need to work together. Whatever your model of the requirements is internally, it will change. I think Tyson said the plan is a plan. What is it? He said something about being punched in the face anyway.
Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah, thanks, Gene. Despite appearances, I haven't been punched in the face recently, but I'm pretty sure that this is a true thing, at least what happens with requirements. So we might have a plan how this team just does this work and that team just does that work. And now we have feature teams and they shouldn't have to talk, but they still do. They still do. But there aren't clear lines. If there are, you won't know what they are in the beginning. You'll discover them along the way. So teams still need to work together. Teams still need to work together. We still need this to happen. It's kind of a fantasy of eliminating shared work. A friend of mine says we actually want to increase shared work because we want teams to learn what other teams are doing and not have the narrow specializations that are leading to the bottlenecks. Come back to this point later on, possibly. All right, so 4.2 was, will features from different teams integrate in a product without teams work together? So even if we use feature teams, those teams still need to talk with each other. They'll still need to integrate their work. First, through conversation and through technical integration, like continuous integration, elimination of branching, working on the trunk, internal open source policies, probably elimination of private code policies, practices over time. Remember, nothing we're talking about in less happens overnight. A less adoption is probably months or years, and then even ongoing after that. We avoid the word transformation, and we don't call it a less transformation. In some people's minds, anyway, it implies a project that we can get done. Okay, it's 3 months in, we've trained everyone, we're done with the transformation, perhaps we did a reorg, and now problem solved and we have agility. People used to call us, when I worked at another company, and they said, well, I want to buy the Scrum. And it's not something that works like that. You can't buy the Scrum. It's not a project, it's an ongoing adoption. And there are so many forces against this that it'll never end. Misconception 4.3. People on this meetup will be familiar with this book. Even better if you've read it. Chapter 7 has a whole conversation about what is a product. Ellen also did a great talk about that, the topic of how do you know what your product is? And places I'm seeing are making this decision arbitrarily. How do you know what your product is? With a preference for a wide view, thinking about a broad view, thinking about what would the customers say your product is, for instance? What's the vision? Are these things that we're calling separate products? So I'll come back to my story about the place I was working with. They have a tricky situation defining product. And it's not obvious to anyone what the product is because they have parts that they sell individually, but those parts also have to work together with other things they sell individually. On top of that, their strategy is not to keep selling. Now, they're going to have to, for legacy reasons, they're going to have to keep selling the individual products. But their strategy, the reason that their stock price doubled, is that the products work together. Synergy has been abused quite a bit since the 80s and 90s, but there really are synergies between these different things that they were calling products. And this is their strategy, is to have these products work together. Now, there are hundreds of people working on these products, and then so it leads to a very confusing problem of who is product owner and what is the product. I will suggest it's something that influential people in the company need to have a serious discussion about and give it a lot of thought. Remember, we're talking about XYZ technical approach, the technical magic. That only works if one side is not changing. But if all sides are changing, it's not going to happen without human beings talking to each other. And we keep trying to buy tools that will prevent the need for people to talk together because we're having trouble making it happen. And of course, it's easier to just buy a tool than to create the environment where people will talk together. Creating an environment where people will talk to each other is really hard. It's organizational simplification. It's a hard thing to do because it suggests changes to our structure. And now we have the problem of, well, we had all these manager roles. I manage these 3 people. She manages those 2 people. What do we do with that? What do we do about their job titles? So it's not an easy problem to solve, and it's not solved overnight. How to create safety for everyone that's involved with that, because we know that fear is going to shut down any kind of agile adoption. I'm not going to pretend any of these things are easy problems to solve, but I wanted to at least shine a light on some of the problems that we have solving them. Bonus content, 7 alternatives to Scrum of Scrums. Let's give a little history lesson. Where's the black book? The first book about Scrum that Ken Schwaber and the late Mike Beagle wrote together. Can't see it with the reflection. There's some interesting ideas in this. You kind of, when you read this, you can also realize that they had some clues about how this worked and why it worked, but they also were still pretty confused about it. And this isn't recommended reading except for me anyway, except for historical purposes. The good ideas from this book were distilled and they wound up in Ken Schwaber's second book, which we used to call the Gray Book back when there were only two books. That was Agile Project Management with Scrum, his 2004 book. And you can see the trajectory in thinking in this book, because they haven't really thought the scaling thing out. They realize, well, Scrum works pretty well at this 12-person company, or the situation, which is this. So if we just add it all together, make more of these things, what we call copy-paste scaling, copy this effective pattern, the result, the sum of that should be effective. And if we think about that for a while and apply that to what we know about how knowledge work is different, we'll realize that, it's not just adding stuff together. It's more complicated than that. It's not just picking apples. Let me make it really clear. I do not recommend this. In this Black Book, the Scrum Master was coordinating for the team at the Scrum of Scrums in this book. Now, with fast forward to 2004, Ken Schwaber's now gains some wonderful insights through direct Gemba time, through observation of what actually happens, and through talking to other people. A fellow named Mel Pullen pointed out, hey, the Scrum of Scrum things, I thought we were supposed to be reducing hierarchies. I thought the reason Scrum worked was that we have no special roles, no special people on the team. We're all just team members. Of course, we have our own background. Maybe I was a software architect in a previous job. I know I'm great at drawing UML diagrams and other stuff like that. Maybe she was a UI designer, UX expert, but in the team room, it's at the team table, it's just us and our skills, and we're meant to leave our job titles at the door of the team. That's how single team Scrum works, and why wouldn't we try to use the same practices for multi-team Scrum, which is why we'll suggest a whole bunch of alternatives which are decentralized. If we want to have a whole product view, we need a shared sense of priorities. We need to know what's more important than something else. So we need a shared vision. There may be other ways to do it, but unless we have a product owner and a product backlog that says this is the direction we want to go, that is centralized, if you like. But the how decisions, as much as possible, are decentralized among the people doing the work. And we want to create the environment where leadership emerges based on situational meritocracy, based on what has to happen. So maybe on Tuesday, Team A needs to talk to Team W about something, and so we want them to just talk. That's our first and our default approach. Someone on Team A needs to talk to someone on the other team. We want to create the environment where they can just talk. That by itself is too general, too vague. How do I even know, if I'm on Team A, how do I even know who I'm supposed to talk to on Team W? There are other patterns, other structures that we can use. The point is that we want to not have special roles, special people. We want it decentralized and on demand based on situational need. Scrum of Scrums will sometimes do that. I'm not saying never do it. And if it's working for you, then keep doing it. But I will also say the ones I've seen didn't do it very well. The ones I've seen were optimizing for something other than adaptability. If we're optimizing our organization to learn new things, that means sometimes we'll be confused. It's necessary to sometimes be confused as part of learning our customers' real needs. There is a whole lot of pressure to never appear confused in companies. And we have a whole level 1 management layer to make sure people are never confused. And there's not very much patience with people sometimes being confused. And so if we optimize for lack of confusion, we're probably not effectively optimizing for learning, for satisfying the customer, for discovering the customer's needs, even though the customer can't tell you exactly what they need in the beginning. Once you've tried some of the other methods, I don't think you would go back to Scrum of Scrums as a default way for teams to coordinate. So one more topic, and then we'll go to all the questions, which hopefully people are tweeting to me or putting in the chat window to Gene.
A bit of both.
90% of Agile, I used to say this also, of Agile coaches, trainers, even people who I have huge respect for, still have the idea that the way to make Agile work in a large organization is to divide the problem in the beginning and then let each of the teams do their hyper-productive thing. And it makes sense in the beginning. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, Scrum works for 7 people. So let's make part of the product for this team, part of the product for that team, part of the product for that team. For the reasons that we've gone through, this is not optimizing in the big picture. In fact, it's actually counterproductive. It's harmful towards the whole product view. We will wind up with, each team has a narrow view. What we've done, if we prematurely make these decisions about which team is going to do what, we bake them in to our organizational design. We bake them into our structure. We've not optimized for whole product agility. It's very likely we'll get teams that working madly on their stuff, but we won't be able to change directions. They won't be having a whole product view. We'll wind up with teams doing work that's 1,000 times less important than other teams. In early days of Agile, we heard a lot of discussions about big design up front being a not beneficial practice towards the Agile evolving software, growing software as we learn more about customer needs. When you prematurely divide the product into work that this team, that team does, what you've done is you've made a big prioritization decision right in the beginning, which we know is when you know the least about your product. Was it Ron Jeffries or Chet Hendricks? Someone says, today is the dumbest day of the rest of your project. Making those decisions in the beginning, this team will do this team will do that, seems to make sense from a traditional perspective, but in the big picture, it's actively harmful towards the whole product view, towards the ability for the whole organization or whole development organization to reprioritize and change directions and pivot, which is what organizations will need to do more and more in the future. Now, you might think this is a lot of pages. Think about the millions of dollars your company is wasting by doing these things badly. You can afford to read these books, seriously. This is Large Scale Scrum, More with Less by Craig Larman and Buzz Fogarty.